Australian young people who are struggling at this time in ways that they haven't in previous generations, because it goes to the heart of why this bill is important, but why other things are also necessary as well. I met a young woman recently. She was in her early 30s. She had one little child, about a 2 or 3 year old, and twins. She came up to me at King's Cross one Saturday morning when I was standing there, and she said, you know, she was a doctor. She said, I used to be a nurse. I then became a doctor. I've just paid off all my HECS debt. My husband, he's a lawyer, used to be a policeman. He also retrained, just paid off his HECS debt. She said, I think I've done everything right. I've tried to make all the good choices, but I cannot see how I'm ever going to have a home of my own. I can't see how I move forward, and I think about this every single day. And this, to me, is absolutely gutting, because this goes to the heart of some of the challenges we have in our country right now, where people who are doing everything right, in this case, you know, an individual who is working to care for people. She cared for my mother, and she talked about how she's caring for people, making all the choices, investing in herself in education, and she cannot get ahead. And this is the problem that we're facing. We're facing it in the tax system, and we are facing it in the education system that we have here in this country. So let's talk now to the bill, because this is an important bill. It is not a perfect bill, but it also doesn't deal with some things that really need to be done. So what does this bill do? It reforms the help system. And I think this reform of the help system will go some way to alleviating financial pressure for many young Australians. And so it is a welcome measure to many young Australians. So I will support this bill. But I also acknowledge that this bill is far from the best version of the bill it could be. There are a number of measures in this bill, and 2 of the 3 measures in this bill, namely the changing in the repayment threshold and introducing marginal repayment system, have enormous merit. Firstly, increasing the payment threshold from the current $54,435 to $67,000 will mean that graduates on lower incomes, on lower salaries, will take home more pay before having to contribute back to the cost of their education. This responds to the fact that over time the repayment schedule for HECS has not kept pace with cost of living, particularly affecting low-income households. Similarly, the Universities Accord identified that the current repayment schedule is unfair, since the stepped increase resulted in some cases of people earning less take-home pay after receiving a pay rise. Now, that just doesn't seem right. But as Professor Andrew Norton argued, these measures in principle sound good. Graduates will earn yet less pay average every year. However, there is some downside in the sense of the marginal increase in the average repayment timeframe, an increase in likelihood of some low-income graduates before the threshold having their HECS index faster than their ability to repay. So these are good measures, but they're not perfect. However, there are a couple of issues with the bill. One is in terms of how we are giving one-off HECS help relief to students. Now, I do support help relief for students, and that is because I believe that in Australia, young people are struggling to achieve the same milestones as their parents. We have a birth rate of 1.5. This is the lowest it has ever been, and this is because young people are saying they can't actually afford to have children, and we as a country will pay the price for that going forward. We are seeing this in the outcomes in our wealth. We see that in the last 10 or so years, households over the age of 65 grew their wealth by around 50%. Households under the age of 35 pretty much went nowhere. And we see that in our tax system. We see that 2 households next to each other, both on $100,000, if a household is retired, they are on average paying half the tax of a young working household. We all know that it's when you are young and working, when you're trying to buy a house, raise kids, that's when you have the most pressures on your income, and that's when our tax system goes for you the most. So this is why I support the measure in this bill that cuts student debt, because I believe that we do need to find ways, and broad ways, to try and support young people in what is a really difficult moment for them right now. But I do have, I think, some questions in terms of how the government designed this part of the bill, and I wish they had frankly, approached a different way. Because the government decided to offer help relief to students by slashing 20% of their account balance at the 1st of June 2025. And look, that's going to help a whole bunch of people, many, many people in my electorate, and I'm extremely pleased about that. However, this policy is extremely dependent on timing, or as economists call it, it is horizontally inequitable. And as E61 estimate in their recent research, a graduate who finished the same degree 4 years ago, and by all accounts can be expected to face the same financial pressures and burdens as someone who graduated today, will experience just half the benefit of this policy relative to someone who graduated last year. So within 4 years, one person gets twice the benefit of somebody else because of the way that this bill has been designed. And that just seems a shame, because frankly, just because you graduated 4 years ago doesn't mean you are less worthy of a reduction in your HECS balance. It doesn't mean that you're less pressured, frankly, in terms of your finances. But it's just the timing. If you graduated, if right now you're at maximum HECS debt, you're going to get the full benefit of this bill. If you have paid it off over time, you're just not. And I don't think that's a particularly fair way of approaching it. And frankly, a young person going into uni right now or starting next year, they're not going to get any benefit from this bill at all. And so this is some of the challenge here. And so, so I do believe that good policy requires, people in the same time to ideally have equal treatment. I recognise that many people in this House, for instance, had free university, which is a luxury that many won't have. But I do think it's of concern that this bill is so sensitive to the timing of when somebody completed their university degrees. In E61 presented other options. They recommended that the government pay each student with a debt a flat amount that equals the equivalent 20% of the average HECS debt. This simple change would have provided $5,500 to all students with a help debt, regardless of their graduation year. The policy would have cost the same, yet it would have mitigated his horizontal inequity based on when a person happens to graduate from university. It would have also given, I hope, possibly the government a longer grace period before pressure mounts for other people to get future cuts of their HECS debt, which is probably going to happen after this one-off debt. That is a problem for future government. I've talked a lot about the help desks and what is important and why this is an important bill, and I recognise that is important. But I also recognise that there are many other issues with the current help system which are problematic and have not been addressed by this bill. I'll put one out there, and actually the member for Kooyong raised this in a second reading amendment, which is the Jobs Ready Graduate Scheme. Because if I go around my community and ask them, how do they think about help desks, how do they think about education, this policy is a policy that keeps on coming up. This policy that was implemented by a previous coalition government increased particularly the cost of arts degrees to around $55,000. They were trying to disincentivise people to go into the arts and more into STEM. It didn't work. It did not achieve its policy objective, but what it did was it burdened arts graduates with an education burden that outstripped, frankly, the costs of the university, and it penalised a group of people who actually have relatively low lifetime earnings. So it wasn't fair either. And this is a shame, that the government hasn't dealt with this problem, because it is a significant problem with the help system, the HECS system, and it is urgent that it is addressed. Another opportunity that has not been dealt with in this bill and was recommended by the Universities Accord was to change the timing of indexation from the 1st of July until compulsory repayments made during the previous year are deducted from a student's balance. And this would help students pay down their loans quicker. So in summary, I will support this measure because it is providing relief to, I believe, a part of the community that really needs it. But I do believe that the government could have done a much better job in terms of designing some aspects of this bill, and this has significant way to go still in addressing some of the problems in our university sector. Thank you.